Everyone thought it was just the groom being late, until they found out why the Mafia boss ran away from his own wedding. And it all started with the object she tried to hide. The chandeliers held their breath the moment he turned. Light fractured on crystal and on the small object at Lena's throat. A hammered silver pendant, dull where years had worn it, bright where a finger had polished it without intent. Cameras tilted, lenses finding the glint as the room leaned forward. 100 cameras, 24 phones, the glint that would puncture a planned story. Michael stood at the head of the dais like a man accustomed to narratives bending around him. Tonight had been choreographed for months. Alliances dressed in black and champagne, speeches rehearsed until the pauses landed like promise. The bride had been chosen to carry the public story into a new chapter of influence. The guests adjusted their ties and whispered of mergers wrapped in silk and vows. Then Michael said a name that didn't belong on any program, and the air changed its mind about everything else. "Lena," he said, and the syllable fell between the orchids and the cameras. Not as an aside, not as an assertion of ownership. It was an introduction, a theft of a moment meant for spectacle. The bride's smile faltered. The orchestra kept a polite chord, but the chord no longer seemed to know which party it belonged to. Lena felt the room change around the pendant. She had come as a courier that morning, a uniformed movement through back corridors, an invisible presence who knew the sound of elevator cables and the soft clack of ledger covers. She had not expected to be seen. She had not expected the pendant to be recognized as anything other than an old thing a bakery woman once gave her, to keep the cold from her neck when winter work shifted her routes. The pendant's chain caught the light and showed the world a private history. Someone near the front, an older woman who used to run a little bakery 2 blocks from Kester Lane, saw it, and the look on her face read like someone who had watched a coin fall into a certain slot and then realized the machine itself had been rigged. In the rows behind, men who made policy for other people's money leaned forward. Sharon and Sharon, 2 of Michael's closest associates, moved in unison, the reflex of power to contain an anomaly. There are moments that announce themselves as events by how quickly bodies suddenly know what to do. A hand reached for the pendant as if to steady it, a man in a tailored jacket, eyes scanning for security risks. Another reached for his phone and started filming, for the first time not because he wanted to record, but because he needed proof that something had happened that he had not ordered. Michael's voice did not waver. It never did. "This woman," he said, pointing with a slow, deliberate index finger, "wears a piece that belonged to Evelyn Kestrel." A ripple moved through the guests. Evelyn Kestrel had been a name that belonged to boarding house plaques and commencements, to a trust that hadn't been spoken of much in the corridors of power of late. Her estate was the sort of thing investors cited as legacy dust, something to mention when you wanted a flavor of continuity. It was a punctuation mark more than a chapter. "She was a friend of my grandmother," Michael said, as if reciting biographical shorthand. His tone suggested ownership of stories, of connections that made his social ledger look richer by association. But the way his gaze cut across the room, calculating, aware of cameras, suggested he had prepared this reveal for the maximum possible effect. The bride rose before she was meant to, searching his face for the cue that would settle her on the stage of the public story. Instead of returning to the script he had promised her, Michael walked off the dais and toward Lena like a man moving across chessboard squares he already owned. The bride was left mid-applause, her bouquet sagging in a hand that had expected a different ending. Those closest to Lena recoiled, People who had seen her deliver parcels and late-night envelopes knew the economy of her life, but not how a small pendant could alter a courtroom of whispers. There were hands at her shoulders, protective, invasive, and then Sharon and Sharon were at the center, their presence the first wave of a containment strategy. They moved to isolate her, to slip the pendant free and place it under a glass somewhere sterile, but the pendant, and what it hinted at, would no longer be contained by velvet. A man with the exacted calm of professional PR materialized alongside the bride and shoved a prepared statement into a microphone. Cameras shoved back. Someone yelled about a rehearsed interruption. Someone else shouted for decorum. The room divided into teams, those who had come for a spectacle and those who recognized, in the flash of a pendant, an argument none of them had prepared to answer. Lena's hands stayed at her sides. She felt, in the muscles of her forearm, the echo of a life measured in the liveries and receipts. She had learned to read paperwork like other people read faces, signatures that were hurried and unequally pressured, stamps that were faded just enough to say the work had been done, initials in the margins meant to reassure someone unseen. This pendant had been a kindness from the bakery woman. "Keep this close, it keeps you warm," she'd said, pressing a velvet pouch into Lena's palm when the courier's fingers were still numb from winter's early work. Lena had kept it for its warmth and for the way it reminded her that someone had once looked at her and offered a small safekeeping. Now it shimmered like evidence under chandeliers, and every man in the room who could turn that shimmer into narrative was moving quickly to do so. They took the pendant from her. They did it politely. Glove-lined hands, a quick lift, a murmur about chain of custody, as if that phrase were natural in the cathedral of marriage. Someone claimed they would keep it safe until the night was over. Lena saw the glove move, the small click as the pendant's clasp surrendered. She could have pulled back. She could have stamped and screamed that no one had the right. Instead, she did something that surprised both her and the room. She smiled half a smile, like someone who had been giving a riddle and couldn't yet see the whole answer. The pendant would not remain a mere ornament. It would become, in the days that followed, a document of claim, a physical trace that a life outside of boardrooms and tabloids could point at and say, "This." That fact unsettled men who'd rested their authority on silent ledgers and signed papers. It was a vulnerability for them and a doorway for Lena. The first act closed not with a scream, but with a photograph. Michael beside Lena, a hand briefly touching the pendant as if to lend it gravity, cameras exploding into capture. The image sent in real time to endless feeds. The photograph would travel the world faster than a legal notice. It would be captioned in 1,000 ways by pundits and exes. For some, it was a scandal. For others, a romantic deviation. For Lena, it was the first evidence that the small objects of her life could be read by people who had never thought to look. There was an on-screen prompt, a small, unpretentious line that flashed over the bottom gutter as the cameras panned and the room tried to resume ceremony. "If this is gripping you, subscribe to follow the fallout." After the flash, the mood in the room shifted into bureaucratic triage. Sharon and Sharon were no longer merely associates. They became triage officers. They pulled the pendant away to a side room under the pretense of protection. A guard locked the door. Media were asked to hold. This was not a moment for sensational release, but a problem to be threaded into the evening's thin fabric. Lena found herself in a corridor lit with sterile fluorescent light, removed from music and orchids. In place of applause, there came the hush of whispered plans. A small table had been set up, polished wood, a single paper evidence bag, and a laminated chain of custody form with boxes for collected by, description, time, and signature. Someone produced gloves. Someone else produced a small business card from a lab. Forensic tests done fast for the sake of clarity, they said. Lena watched the gloves as they handled the pendant. Her life up until that moment had been a ledger of impossibilities. A grandmother long dead and a bakery woman's kindness. A pendant with an unknown metal composition. A courier who had never meant to be the center of any narrative. She had learned to measure exposure, what to keep close, what to allow to the light. The pendant belonged to the last of those calculations. Now it was being treated like an object that might be read by experts, its marks and dents compared and catalogued. She felt the first intimations of a trial that would not be adjudicated by a judge, but by a sequence of forms and the integrity of men who filled them out. They called a lab in the city. It was a fast-for-fee service that promised an answer in less than 2 hours. A surface analysis, a test for trademarks, an attempt to match etching to registered craftspeople. The consultant, a woman with a scarf tied at fashionable angles, spoke with the authority of someone used to turning curiosity into deliverable conclusions. She suggested a quick sequence: swab, bulk spectrometer check, cataloging. Chain of custody, Lena said, surprising herself by vocalizing the phrase with a new kind of care. It was a word of law and process, the architecture of trust in evidence handling. The scarfed consultant smiled, like someone who'd won games with words before. "We've done this thousands of times," she said. "We'll need a sample, a few clear photos, and about an hour. We'll put a seal on the bag, and you'll have preliminary results that will explain the association." Lena watched the sealed bag close. She watched the consultant sign the form and watched Sharon take a photo of the signature. She felt, in that movement, the beginning of a story that the men of influence intended to write on her behalf. She could see the lines. A fast forensic result would place the pendant in a context that bolstered Michael's narrative. She could see the way money could sharpen evidence into a shape convenient for powerful people. She knew from the way addresses were whispered in the corridor that there had been arrangements made long before tonight, people on retainer who could produce quick facts to protect reputations. But Lena had something the men had not counted on: a battered notebook she kept in her bag, the sort of thing couriers filled with routes and names and the occasional odd instruction. In the back of that notebook was the trace of another life, a note scribbled in a pressure that matched Evelyn Kestrel's known signature on a charity letter Lena had once glimpsed in a secondhand photograph. And tucked inside the notebook was a small USB drive, black and inconspicuous, the kind of object couriers often handled, carrying invoices and delivery manifests on corporate devices. The consultant and the men at the table had not noticed the notebook at first. They had the job to do, to make the pendant mean the thing their versions needed it to mean. For a moment, Lena considered handing over the notebook like the pendant. Let it be processed by their forms, trusted on their terms. But the ledger in her head, the list of names who had been disappeared into private ledgers, told her this was not an option. She did something more dangerous and more patient. She pulled the notebook from her bag, opened it, and quietly set it on the table. The room turned toward it as if the air itself was obeying some older law of attention. Lena's handwriting was not neat. It was practical, immediate. On the inside cover, someone had written years ago, "To be kept with care, E.K." The initials were smudged. A line later read, "Kestrel Holding, A.G., see trustee page." It was a footnote to a claim. It did not, by itself, decide a legacy. It was an invitation to follow a paper trail. "Where did you get that?" Sharon asked, almost too quickly. His voice suggested he had already decided to say that the notebook was something Lena had fabricated to complicate the night. "From the bakery," Lena said. "Mrs. Caro kept it with her records. She said Evelyn used to drop by sometimes. She gave me the pendant and asked me to look after it." The room smelled suddenly of coffee and perfume and the faint antiseptic tang of paper. The scarfed consultant, always alert to the shape of an easy explanation, said, "That's a convenient story. We can run the pendant and fast-track the results. If there's a match to anything registered, we'll know." Her hands were already reaching for a phone to place the order. It was the moment when two kinds of truth tried to occupy the same space. One was the speed of modern reputation management, a lab call, a pre-written statement, a re-photographing of everything for a spin. The other was the patient, slow work of documents, signatures, and notary seals that, given time, unravel stories that had been market managed for years. Lena had to choose which race to join. She refused the convenience. "Don't," she said, and the word landed with the weight of someone who had watched whole lives because a single fast test said what someone with influence wanted it to say. If you run that fast service, you won't have the chain documented the way it needs to be. The results can be manufactured. There are shortcuts. Sharon's mouth tightened. The scarfed consultant tilted her head. "Manufactured," she echoed. "That's a strong accusation." "It's not an accusation," Lena said. "It's a fact. These services are hired to produce narratives quickly. If you want something that can hold under a subpoena, you follow a chain properly. You log who had it. You seal it. You document. You timestamp. Quick answers don't survive depositions." Reed arrived in the doorway then, not with the camera-ready posture of men who expected to be seen, but with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd learned to work in rooms where decisions were made by forms and signatures rather than applause. He had been at the edge of the event, a friend of a friend, a man who knew how to read ledgers the way other people read faces. He had seen Lena in the back corridor the morning before, picking up a package and taking a route that avoided cameras. He had felt the gravitational pull of tonight and came at a walk that bore no attention. "She's right," Reed said, and his voice was the kind that made people pause because it implied both knowledge and restraint. He moved to the table, took a gloved hand, and suggested a different path. Seal it in the presence of an independent witness. Get a notary on call. Photograph every signature and every swap with timestamps that can be verified against server logs. Sharon's jaw worked. "You think we don't have that?" "No," Reed said. "I think you do. But public nights make people sloppy. If this goes to court, the first thing they'll ask is when the evidence left your hands and when it entered the lab. If you plan to be on the right side of that answer, then you do it clean." The scarfed consultant's smile thinned. She glanced at her phone as if weighing a tip-off into the ledger of a substitution. There was a particular kind of money that moved through rooms like this, not always in cash, often in favors, in promises of future quiet. Reed's presence complicated those ledgers. He didn't hold himself out as a savior. He simply proposed a different sequence, slower, more documented, and therefore less malleable. Lena watched their faces, her skin pricked with the pleasure and the danger of being seen right. It was a curious power. The men would attempt to seize narrative with speed. Her counter was patience and paperwork. She didn't want revenge. She wanted truth, durable enough to change where funds moved and how trusts were honored. She thought of Evelyn's name written in that notebook like a quiet claim, and of the bakery woman who had pressed velvet into her hands with a soft, steady gaze. When Reed suggested an independent lab, Sharon barked a laugh that was almost a sound of dismissal. "We have people," he said. "We trust our consultants. We have—" "Trust is not a substitute for process," Reed said, "and process is what protects everyone, even you." Cade Marrow appeared then, not from the crowd, but from the same cloud of discreet influence that seemed to orbit Michael. He had a fixer's gait and an accountant's patience. He moved without the theatricality of the bride's handlers, without the theatrical costuming of PR men. He arrived with a single thought: to keep the story manageable. When he smiled, it was the smile of someone used to smoothing wrinkles in contracts and in people's reputations. Or, Cade said softly, we can pay to make it go away. It hung in the air, not as a threat, but as an offer of efficient erasure, hush money wrapped in the language of convenience. There are offers that are made with such cadence that they sound like solutions, and there are lives that have been saved by the quickness of a check. Lena had never been paid for silence. She had a pride fashioned by small, steady work. Money could close doors, but it could not, she suspected, rewrite what the pendant represented. She looked at Cade's hand, then at the notebook, then at the velvet bag the bakery woman had put into her hands months ago. She thought about what Evelyn's name might mean if it were upheld by law. The dormant trust, not as a rumor, but as an institution that could fund clinics, that could protect the bakery women and couriers and people who lived on routes that never made headlines. No, Lena said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. I won't take that. The room shifted at that refusal. Some people longed for a clean purchase. Take the money, sign the release, go home. Others recognized the fissure in that pattern. For Reed, the refusal was not bravado, but logic. For Cade, it was a problem that could be solved with more money. Michael, watching from the periphery, registered all of it with the flatness of a man who had known how to turn defeats into spins. It's inconvenient, he said softly when he stepped closer, not to Lena, but to Reed and the small group that had gathered. He spoke as if the world owed him agreement. People pick stories to tell, and we cannot have a narrative that undermines the structure we've built for the evening. Then we'll follow the structure the law provides, Reed answered. We will document. We will have third-party verification. No quick tests run by parties with a stake in the outcome. A murmur of assent passed. The scarfed consultant who had first offered the fast answer hesitated. She checked her phone, then her ledger. Her business depended on trust too, on the ability to produce results that clients could rely on, and she sensed the danger of a quick result that could be subpoenaed and undone. So they did the slow thing. They sealed the pendant in a bag. Reed called a notary. The consultant signed, but also agreed to withhold any public statement pending full chain of custody documentation. Cameras prodded at the underbelly of procedure. News vans idled under lipsticked bridesmaids. A photographer tried to catch the look that might become a headline. But inside the corridor, parted from public spectacle, men sat at a table and wrote down names and times and signatures. The chain of custody form grew a history of itself. The nervous scrawl of a guard who had clocked a time, the neat block letters of a consultant who dated things with a practiced hand. In the glossary of legal fights, that kind of patience is a weapon disguised as tedium. A timestamp is a small, patient guillotine for false narratives. It does not flash, it endures. Lena felt a strange thrill watching signatures accumulate. Those checkboxes would now be arguable in hearings. They would be countersigned in depositions if anyone later attempted to erase them. And yet, the world outside had already started to narrate itself in faster ink. Clips of Michael smiling at the dais, Lena's pendant catching the chandelier, the bride's abandoned smile, those images metastasized across feeds. The pendant carried baggage that the internet insisted on weighing with immediate verdicts. Some headlines called it romance, others whispered scandal. None of them, at first, noticed the notebook tucked under Lena's arm. They took the pendant to the lab with proper seals and time-stamped photos. The consultant insisted on transferring custody to a team with an established chain of custody log. They photographed each handoff and saved the metadata to a centralized server. Reed insisted on backups being logged to an independent external drive that could be accessed by lawyers if shadow accounts or suspicious edits appeared. In the quiet of the corridor, a lawyer whispered about subpoenas and the slow teeth of audits. The word subpoena relaxed like an inhalation in the mouths of the men at the table. It was no longer just a threat. It was possible. Then, like the first cold curl of a storm that had been observed but not believed, an initial report came back from a lab that had been paid by a party with ties to the bride's circle. The scarfed consultant's smile returned for the cameras, and the consultant read from a prepared line. Preliminary analysis suggested the pendant had modern repairs inconsistent with an original Evelyn Kestrel piece. The room shifted. Sharon allowed himself a brief, satisfied exhale. It was the sort of preliminary result that would be spoken of at cocktail parties as confirmation. It would be used by PR teams to reshape headlines, to make the pendant an object of curiosity rather than proof. The consultant handed out a sheet with fast bullet points. The words inconclusive, modern alloy, and possible repair wavered across a header. Cameras found the sheet. A clip went live before anyone parsed the stomping fallacies in the chain of custody. Lena felt something like cold smoke. The word inconclusive carried a particular kind of violence. It turned a claim into an argument about memory and manufacture. It suggested the pendant could be dismissed as clever accessory rather than evidence of lineal claim. She could have let the accusation sit on its own, let the messy tide of public skepticism do its work. Instead, she saw, with the clarity that had kept her moving through back doors for years, that the fast result was a mechanism, a way of diluting responsibility by introducing doubt. "That's not the full chain," Reed said softly, stepping forward. He'd seen enough sloppily produced conclusions to know the gestures of a manufactured result. Who ran this test? "A contractor," Sharon said immediately. "A lab we retain for private work. They do quick turnarounds. Full disclosure." "Who paid them?" Reed asked. "Payments are private," Cade said, as if meaning that the movement of money was a matter beyond the taxonomies of the present conversation. His tone implied both the normality of the arrangement and a hope that fast cash could solve the awkwardness of tonight's reveal. Reed took a breath. "Then we need to see the payment trail. We need the invoices and the chain of custody that lab used. We need to validate every transfer." "You think I don't have invoices?" Sharon demanded. "It's not about invoices," Reed said. "It's about timestamps, about server logs from the lab's data systems, about who signed what and when. Quick labs are easily influenced. If you want to make this hold up, you let an independent lab run the analysis with unbroken chain of custody." There was a pause in which the world outside, the music, the clink of glass, tried to resume, but inside, men who had been taught to move smoothly through reputational messes were forced to admit a simple truth: process matters. The scarfed consultants' prepared lines lost their luster when asked to produce the administrative scaffolding they used to construct them. For a moment, the night split into two legal tempos. One tempo was the speed of public attention that could be bent and restyled in a single news cycle. The other tempo was the slow, patient bureaucracy of forms and seals that unmade convenient narratives by virtue of being verifiable. Lena watched both tempos. She felt the hunger in the room for the fast result to prevail. She felt the cold, pragmatic satisfaction that might come if paper could be used to reroute money into clinics and trust funds rather than the private pockets of men who invested in silence. She thought of Evelyn, of a name tucked into the back of a notebook that now sat crystalline on the table like a small, dangerous truth. The consultant, sensing the shift, offered a caveat and then a faster path. We can rerun. We can involve our head lab and have a corroborating analysis. It will take longer, but we can get a more complete result. That's what we want, Reed said. Independent, documented, third party. The consultant's smile was full of measured patience. She dialed a number and placed another call, setting into motion the slower machinery Reed had asked for. Men in the corridor returned to their phones with the kind of seriousness that moved beyond spectacle. The ballroom remained a stage for the curious. The corridor trended toward accounting. Lena felt a weight lift slightly. The fast result could still become a headline and could still shape public opinion in the interim. But paper, once properly logged and sealed, could be turned into a lever. It could not be collapsed with one press of money. The pendant, small and hammered, had become an axis for a fight that would not be settled by tweets or late-night punditry, but by people willing to sit with forms. When Reed looked at her, his eyes asked a question that in the weeks to come would be asked by more people in more rooms. Were you prepared to follow this through? Lena thought of the bakery woman and of Evelyn's initials smudged like a promise. She thought of the couriers who delivered envelopes and lunches, and sometimes the small kindnesses that kept other people's infrastructures running. She thought of what the dormant trust, if it was real, could become: clinics and scholarships, and a small endowment to stabilize a neighborhood that had been smoothed out by corporate expansion. Yes, she said, I'm prepared. Reed nodded once. He was not effusive. His nod had the efficiency of someone who had seen many people begin what they did not finish. Then we move slow, and we make sure every step has witnesses. They set to work in the corridor while guests clinked in the ballroom and a DJ adjusted the tempo to mask tension with music. Reed called a friend at a well-regarded independent lab. He asked for an immediate consultation without invoking the names that might influence the impartiality of the analysis. He asked, with the economy of someone who understood legal time, about chain of custody protocols, about server logs, about the metadata that would later stand up in a deposition. Lena watched the pendant again, now behind a seal and photographed with timestamps. It was a small object doing the heavy work of a dossier. It had once been an amulet for warmth. It had become a problem for men who assumed they could buy narrative with the same currency they used to buy silence. Outside, news vans adjusted headlines and a trending clip condensed the night into a minute-long scandal. The internet made stories of the bridal moment and called it everything: romance, betrayal, disruption. Few of those shorthand narratives saw the corridor where forms and signatures were being accrued. Fewer still understood that a patient, methodical process could, in the end, do more to redistribute power than any fling of retaliation. But the first test had landed. A preliminary result intended to humiliate hit like a splinter. It drove people to one of two choices: either accept the quick dismissal and allow the pendulum of public rumor to swing, or invest in a slower, more durable truth. Reed and Lena chose the latter. For now, that choice looked small. It was a choice to call witnesses, to archive photos with timestamps, to insist on a third-party lab with an uncompromised server log. It was a choice to refuse hush money and insist on process. It was a decision that would require patience, resources, and the willingness to watch a story be told in forms rather than headlines. As the corridor filled with quiet acts of documentation, Sharon left the sealed pendant on the table and went toward the ballroom like a man returning to press his hand on a wound he wanted to keep intact. Cade stayed, calculating in that silent way, while the scarfed consultant packed a case and moved to expedite a second test under new auspices. Michael watched it all, and for a moment there was a shadow that crossed his face. Not fear so much as the consideration of a contingency for a contingency. He, too, had something at stake in the slow paperwork of names. Lena tucked her notebook under her arm and considered the small USB in the back pocket. The pendant was the loud object that had detonated the night. The notebook and USB were the quiet things that might actually hold the architecture of a claim. They escorted her back to the ballroom not as a guest who would resume a scripted part, but as someone whose presence now carried consequence. Applause had thinned into the polite tensing of an audience who had just been forced to witness a fissure in a staged narrative. A few hands reached for her with curiosity. Many more watched at a distance, wondering whether spectacle would flatten into policy. By the time the lights dimmed back to party level, Reed had arranged for a secure storage of copies of Lena's notebook and for a lawyer to stand by the corridor in the morning. He told her, quietly, that the night would put them in a position not to act out of vengeance, but to marshal rules, subpoenas, independent audits, depositions. Those words, subpoena and audit, had a dryness to them that masked their power. Lena felt a surge of something close to relief. She did not want revenge. She wanted accountability that could be extended beyond tonight into the neighborhood where the bakery woman still woke before sun for bread. The night closed with ceremony resumed, but different. The public story had been interrupted and would require a restitching. For now, the pendant sat behind sealed glass, a small relic that had refused to be turned into entertainment. For Lena, the pendant had become a question that would not be silenced by champagne or cameras. When the last guests drifted away, Reed walked with Lena down the back staircase that led to a city where refrigerators hummed and people whose names never made headlines began another day. He spoke in short sentences about process and timing, about people they would need and things they might demand. The first thing, he said, is to preserve everything we have. Second, we need more documentation of Evelyn's estate. You said the bakery had something? She kept letters, Lena said, old bills, a ledger. She said Evelyn used to sit there sometimes and talk with customers. Good, Reed said. We archive that. We make copies and timestamps. We secure your notebook and the USB. We make sure everything is backed up to independent servers. We won't rely on fast labs. We'll set up an independent chain. And if they push back? Lena asked. She felt the gravity of the question like a stone in her pocket. They always do, Reed said. Process isn't quick. It takes time, but it lasts. They stepped into the night. The city's lights had a different cast away from chandeliers. Here, sodium glare and wet pavement made the world hard-edged and honest. Lena folded the pendant's image into her memory and felt how small objects can shift large systems. In the days to come, men would try to buy silence and quick certainty. Men would offer money where paperwork might be required. Some would move to erase the notebook, to manufacture the edges of the truth with paid labs and friendly signatures. But there were rules, brittle, patient, maddening rules that mattered. Timestamps, not rage. Subpoenas, not spectacle. The pendant had become an argument, and she intended to make the argument stick. They left with plans. Reed would call the independent lab in the morning, a notary would be on standby, a lawyer would draft preservation notices. Lena would go to the bakery and ask for whatever documents the woman still had. It was a practical kind of revolution, the kind that happened in filings and depositions and in the patient collection of signatures. If the night had been a punctuated drama, what followed would be a protracted, surgical process. Lena knew the headlines would get louder and meaner in the interim. She expected PR statements and whispers. She also expected men like Cade and Sharon to test every seam. But she had a notebook and a velvet pouch and a stubbornness built on years of moving things from point A to point B without being noticed. That skill, the discipline of a courier, would serve her well in the dull arithmetic of paperwork. As they walked away from the ballroom, a small, near-invisible camera on the traffic pole across the street blinked. Somewhere, a data log would be made of their steps. It would be one of the thousands of small records that, gathered together, would form a case as strong as the people who chose to build it. The world of headline justice would rage and spin. The world of legal correction would accumulate files. Inside Lena's pocket, the notebook pressed on the USB, and the pendant's image floated across the back of her eyelids. In the weeks to come, that pendant would be photographed 1,000 times. It would be tested again and again. For the men who feared its implications, it was a nuisance. For Lena, it was a responsibility that had been thrust upon her by a moment of public embarrassment and by a man who preferred the spectacle of power to its quiet obligations. They stepped into rain and a cab, and Reed made a call to a lab he trusted. He spoke in the language of timestamps and server logs, and Lena listened. The night had given her a role she had not asked for. Not heir in a romantic sense, but steward in a legal one. Her idea of stewardship was small and bureaucratic and expansive all at once. It would require patience, and it would require the stamina to sit in rooms where nothing was dramatic, but much was decided. At the hotel where Reed's contact suggested they meet, there was a safe deposit of forms ready to be signed the next morning. Lena looked at her reflection in a blackened window and at the pendant's photograph that someone had already uploaded. The comments below the clip were a thicket of assumptions. Some called her opportunistic, some called her brave. A few recognized an old pendant in a modern world. None of them knew about the notebook in her bag, and none of them knew about the bakery woman's hands pressing velvet into another's palm on a cold morning. The first test's fast result would make headlines tomorrow. The more durable work, subpoenas, audits, independent labs, would begin when the city woke. Lena folded the notebook and USB into her bag. She slept on a small bed that vibrated near an elevated train. Her dreams were not cinematic. They were ledger-like, columns aligning, signatures appearing in neat rows. In the morning, she would go to the bakery and meet the woman who had given her the pendant. She would ask for receipts. She would ask for a story. She would ask, quietly and plainly, to be trusted. Outside, the city hummed. Inside, a small object rested sealed and photographed, a pendant that had once been warmth against winter and was now a legal hinge. The men who wanted to return to their narratives plotted. The men who saw process as an inconvenient thing readied their contrivances. Lena readied hers too, not with noise and spectacle, but with the steady accumulation of stamped pages and witnesses willing to sit through the tedium of truth. The first act, the public reveal, the seizure of the pendant, and the initial attempt to blur its meaning with a fast lab result had closed, but the room had not forgotten. The pendant, once a private warmth against a courier's collar, now occupied a forensic sequence of photographs, timestamps, and signatures. Outside, headlines multiplied. Inside, Reed and Lena began to assemble the slow machinery that would need to be patient enough to outlast money and quick spin. Morning arrived with the same indifferent gray the city always offered to small revolutions. Lena went to the bakery first. Mrs. Caro, who worked the ovens like a woman who understood both dough and secrets, met her with flour on the back of her hands and a caution in her eyes. The shop had a ring of regulars who left notes and bills tucked under jars. The ledger on the counter was written in a cramped, economical hand. "You kept things," Lena said, more statement than question. The bakery woman did not answer with words at once. She produced a shoebox of yellowed envelopes and a worn receipt book tied with twine. Evelyn's name appeared in ink, in different hands, once in tidy charity solicitations, once as a scribbled note about visiting on Thursdays, once beneath a receipt for a dozen rolls. For anyone who understood how papers could assemble into a map, the shoebox mattered. Mrs. Caro pressed a small key into Lena's palm. "Kept it because she asked me to," she said. Said if anything happened, give it to someone who treats things like they're alive. Lena thought of the whispered phrase Reed used in the corridor, "Process protects everyone," and felt the old courier reflex of moving items from hands to hands with care. She photographed each envelope, scanned receipts to an independent server, and logged every movement in a chain of preservation document Reed had drafted the night before. They set not just copies, but verified hashes, digital fingerprints meant to show a file had not been altered. Reed, efficient and quietly fierce, began contacting names: a notary who would be willing to sign under urgency, an independent Swiss firm that handled trust validation without taking headlines as retainer, a forensic digital lab whose reputation for uncompromised server logs made them expensive but legally durable. He scheduled depositions with the scarfed consultant and Cade's accounting point of contact. He asked Lena to tell every courier story she remembered with dates: the extra envelope left unclaimed, the woman who occasionally asked Evelyn's driver to wait. Small things could become corroboration when threaded together. Back at the firm's corridor, the pendant sat under a second seal, and with more eyes on it than velvet ever deserved. The independent lab Reed had contracted insisted on a secure courier and an unbroken chain. Witnesses watching the item leave one set of gloved hands and enter another, the GPS log of the transport vehicle, the sealed trunk photographed at each step. The lab's technicians, spare and professional, moved with the tedious respect of people who knew that in court, a photograph of a glove mattered as much as the metal composition under a microscope. The first useful crack in the other side's armor came from something their PR had not bought: an email thread left in a semi-public file server of a boutique lab the bride's team used for fast clarity. Reed's lawyer had issued a preservation notice, followed by a subpoena request, and an internal audit program had flagged a series of routine expenses that suddenly looked less routine when mapped across shell accounts. The query started as an ordinary request to reconcile invoices and turned into an exposure of patterns. In one thread, a lab manager had forwarded an internal memo with a header that read, "Protect Narrative." It was a terse phrase, 2 words, and it had been sent from a scheduler's account to the scarfed consultant's business line. Beneath it, an attachment contained a payment spreadsheet, wire transfers routed through a conduit company with an innocuous name and labeled in the ledger as vendor services. The amounts were small enough to claim plausible deniability and large enough to exert pressure on a boutique lab's account. Reed's team followed the money. Small wires became larger nodes when traced across banking relationships. They reached into accounts that paid for private services, PR retainer, expedited lab fees, the sort of payments that in isolation would be explained away, but in aggregate sketched the outlines of a deliberate campaign. When they subpoenaed the contractor's servers, they found an edited file history, timestamps that had been altered, and metadata that suggested a hurried rewrite after the wedding. The scarfed consultant's fast report, the inconclusive headline that had soothed party guests the night before, had been built on that fragile foundation. It would not survive scrutiny. The revelation did not come as a theatrical unmasking. It arrived like dry rot, slow and undeniable. Depositions scheduled by Reed's counsel sat into conference rooms with glass, where the scarfed consultant answered questions in clipped tones while lawyers asked for the origin of checks and the logout times for servers. Reed watched as a senior technician, someone whose name had been a footnote on invoices, described the way payment priorities influenced reporting schedules. Under oath, the technician said, with the apologetic air of a person who had done as instructed for a pay schedule that meant mortgage payments, sometimes the jobs that paid more got faster lanes. Who directed the payment priorities? The opposing counsel asked. A pause that admitted nothing at all stretched. Then the technician's eyes slid away. We followed the account manager's request. The chain led back through invoices to Cade's firm. Cade's response was quiet and practiced. He claimed only to have been consulted about reputational risk. On a recorded line held by a trustee's assistant, a voicemail hung with the phrase, "Make sure the narrative holds." It was not much. It was enough. With every step Reed took, the other side tightened. Sharon and Sharon prodded at the board. Investors with portfolios sensitive to scandal asked for explanations. Michael, who until then had carried his influence like an accepted currency, felt the edges of that currency being counted and constrained. The board of directors of Kestrel Holding AG convened an emergency session after a string of investors demanded an independent review. A corporate secretary read excerpts of a preservation notice and described the subpoenas Reed's team had initiated as a potential conflict of interest requiring third-party review. The language of business began to do the work of courts: suspensions, provisional trusteeship, temporary injunctions. Michael's first formal loss of ground came not with a bang but with a motion. The motion was procedural but consequential. A petition for a temporary freeze of discretionary transfers and for the appointment of an interim trustee to oversee philanthropic disbursements pending verification of Evelyn's trust documents. It was exactly the kind of legal instrument Reed had hinted at in the corridor: slow, patient, and dense with paperwork. The judge assigned to the matter, a judge known for an unsentimental approach to evidence integrity, signed an order for preservation and a temporary freeze. Bank compliance officers received sealed court orders. Assets marked discretionary were flagged. The freeze did not collapse Michael's entire operation, no single injunction could, but it robbed him of the simple, immediate instruments of influence. Wire access that had been routine now required countersignatures. Accounts moved into review, and a private jet's manifest came under scrutiny by counsel representing a lender who did not enjoy surprises. When a bank received an official court order that required them to hold transfers, their internal compliance systems lighted up with alerts. For a man who had always used expedient funds to smooth problems, the system's slow hand was a new and grinding complication. Reed's lawyers continued to file requests for server logs, for signed affidavits from the lab's technicians, for depositions of the scarfed consultant, Cade's CFO, and the accounting clerk who had labeled wires as vendor services. The firm representing Michael countered with motions to quash or to limit disclosure, a standard defense meant to push the matter toward settlement. They hoped to trade time for the public's fading attention. Time, however, had not been on Michael's side, especially when digital traces refused to be rewritten. As subpoenas began to take effect, the scrawl of payments and emails knit faster into a damning pattern. Reed's team presented an exhibit that was small and precise: a chain of emails linking the lab's scheduler to a consulting contractor, followed by a ledger of payments originating from a shell company in a further off jurisdiction. When the notary verified that the pendant's custody had been proper, and when the independent lab released a full report, complete with preserved raw data and a server log that showed no tampering, the preliminary inconclusive result that had been paraded in the ballroom became a footnote. The independent analysis established two things with legal credibility. The pendant bore an old maker stamp consistent with Evelyn's era, and there were microscopic repair marks that dated from a long time ago rather than indicating recent modification. Those findings by themselves did not create a trust, but they removed a convenient lie from the conversation. More importantly, Reed's team used the lab's server logs to show the discrepancy between the time the scarfed consultant's report went live and the time the lab's internal files were changed. Server timestamps, once marshaled and validated, made for a difficult fiction. Public pressure and legal precision together shifted investor sentiment. A major institutional investor, sensitive to reputational liabilities, publicly announced it would withhold further capital from ventures tied to Michael until the trust's documents were validated. Another quietly requested an audit of corporate donations listed under Evelyn's name. When the board met, the motion to suspend Michael pending a full independent audit carried more votes than expected. The motion did not claim guilt, it claimed prudence. Michael's response to the suspension was neither theatrical nor placid. He moved like a strategist would. He consulted lawyers, he attempted to make long calls that ended abruptly, he sent out controlled statements that framed the pause as temporary administrative housekeeping. But the legal orders had traction. Banks that once moved with an informal nod now raised procedural flags. Jewel inventories were locked for the duration of the preservation order. Trustees in neutral jurisdictions began to ask for certified copies of the Kestrel instruments. The day the board voted, Michael's phone began to ring with a different tone. Lenders quietly withdrew a line. A partners' council sent a note reasserting contractual covenants that required positive performance conditions. Advisors told him the optics were bad. He scheduled a press statement and then canceled. The suspension's ripple traveled through his circle the way a thrown stone makes concentric waves. Friends who had relied on his presence called, then stopped when they received their own legal notices. The city watched. Then, one evening, while Reed was at the office cross-referencing bank records and Lena was at the bakery cataloging envelopes, they received the message every strategist fears. Michael could not be reached at his known numbers. His flights were canceled, a private aircraft that had been on the manifest was listed as off-grid. His residences showed no movement on utility logs. Advisors claimed he had retreated to a private compound. Others whispered he had left the country. Reed's counsel suggested two possible readings: flight or enforced retreat to avoid asset seizure and the glare of imminent subpoenas. The disappearance, when it was finally announced through the press by an intermediary, was framed in neutral language. Michael Jones was unavailable for comment and presently off the grid as legal processes progress. It was an explanation that preserved the semblance of stability while acknowledging that the man who had stood at the dais had receded from view. For every gossip column that leapt to conspiracies, there was a legal explanation being assembled. Counsel arguing that his absence was a pragmatic sheltering while counsel prepared defenses against criminal referral, if any such referral were to come. The title's claim, Mafia Boss Disappeared, was rendered in the public eye as a man accustomed to power stepping back in the face of legal mechanics. Internally, the effect was the same. He was gone from the levers of immediate control. Lena watched this happen like someone who had once watched an elevator door close on a delivery she was making. There was a private relief in the idea of his absence, less spectacle, more space to build. She carried the pendant in a small velvet-lined box in her bag. It felt absurd, ordinary, and heavy all at once. Reed's counsel advised caution. Disappearance could be used as a narrative by the other side to claim persecution or to stoke fear. They would not allow theatrics to become the currency of the remainder of the fight. Depositions continued. The scarfed consultant's testimony, when cross-examined with the payment records, became brittle. Under oath, she conceded that her lab had accepted the contract to produce a fast result and that the invoice for that service had been routed through an intermediary. When asked if she had been aware of the Protect narrative memo, she froze and then admitted she'd seen it but had assumed it referred to internal scheduling. The technician who had admitted to prioritizing paying clients' jobs for cash flow offered a fuller account. He had been told to expedite a private job and had seen the results he produced rushed into a press packet before the lab's internal validation processes had completed. Each admission was small and specific. Together, they composed a pattern. The press chewed at the edges of the case, as media will. Social feeds that had once treated the pendant as gossip now threaded in legal documents, carefully cut and cited by journalists who had learned to read server logs the way other people read party lists. Reporters identified the shell companies, traced the conduit accounts, and showed annotated timelines that matched Reed's filings. The phrase "protect narrative" leaked into headlines and then into the broader conversation about influence and accountability. The sound of it, 2 words, began to mean something larger. Michael's absence hardened the board's stance. The motion for a full audit passed. The court extended the temporary freeze into an injunctive order for the specific accounts associated with Evelyn's charitable disbursements, pending the outcome of the trust verification process. Trustees from neutral jurisdictions were called to participate in a joint review. Reed's counsel worked with Swiss notaries to identify authenticated copies of Evelyn's directives. An archival search returned a set of notarized letters and a certification of a trust instrument that matched the handwriting Lena had seen in the notebook. Validating the Swiss documents was not a single declarative moment. It required signatures, apostilles, certified translations, and corroboration from independent trustees who could confirm the provenance of the instruments. Each step took time in the usual bureaucratic way. Not the dramatic time of press cycles, but the patient time of notarized seals and countersigned affidavits. That was the kind of work Lena favored. She thought of Evelyn's initials smudged in a notebook and felt that the legal slow work honored a memory better than any headline. When the court accepted enough corroboration to name Lena as an interim beneficiary with standing to move against fraudulent diversions of the trust, she did not celebrate. The order gave her authority to request ledgers, to demand audits, and to propose temporary governance for the distributions. It did not make her rich, nor did it give her the power to permanently disinherit the living. What it did, practically, was allow her to pause discretionary transfers that had been flowing into vaguely defined operational expenses and redirect them into verified accounts under oversight. She could, for the first time, place a brake on the private funnels of philanthropy that had operated without transparency. Sharon and Sharon filed motions opposing some of these measures, standard tactics intended to make the process longer, more expensive, more fraying. Cade attempted to negotiate and offered to appoint a neutral administrator to audit accounts with a firm they proposed. Reeve pushed back. He insisted on independent auditors chosen by the court. Litigation strategy is often a negotiation over who gets to name the neutral, and Reed had been careful to propose firms with reputations for refusing retainer influence. The court obliged. Community voices, people who had once been an aside in Evelyn's charity list, began to speak. The bakery woman, Mrs. Caro, appeared at a hearing with a folded ledger and a memory that matched the documents Lena had collected. She spoke quietly and plainly about Evelyn's visits, about the way the old woman had liked black coffee and to give small coins to kids on tins of bread. Her testimony was unadorned and it had weight because it was simple. Lena watched her in the witness box, a small woman whose hands trembled slightly when she handed over a receipt. In a world where testimony is often performed, the bakery woman offered facts. As they pushed deeper into the ledgers, auditors found anomalies, transfers labeled vaguely as consultancy fees that, when traced, looped through a web of entities with no clear services to declare. One such transfer had been routed through a consultancy that listed a shell address. Another invoice bore a watermark from a printing house that had, according to its own records, printed social invitations, not legal instruments, during the same time. The auditor's job was to render what had looked like plausible expense lines into a narrative of improper diversions. They did so with spreadsheets and footnotes. There were moments of legal theater, a deposition where the scarfed consultant's counsel tried to limit the scope of questioning, a late-night filing that alleged a violation of privilege, but the momentum favored process. Subpoenas compelled bank compliance officers to testify about when holds had been placed and why. A compliance officer admitted on the record that a sudden flurry of pressure from political actors had tried to secure the release of funds. That admission made its way into a supplemental exhibit and onto more headlines that suggested the appearance of influence had been exercised to close down scrutiny. Michael, in the meantime, remained absent from public life. His disappearance was not presented as a crime, but as a retreat. Some lawyers argued he had taken counsel to preserve assets in jurisdictions outside immediate reach. Others suggested he had gone into a protective hiding to avoid aggressive asset seizure maneuvers that could complicate eventual defense strategies. Whatever the intention, his absence meant one practical thing. He no longer managed the tactical responses that once flowed like conversations over late-night drinks. His absence made the network of influence brittle. In the absence of a dramatic confrontation, the court's findings accumulated in quiet increments. A sealed ruling allowed for temporary control of certain charitable lines. An audit report cataloged transfers that lacked substantive vendor contracts. A deposition transcript captured the technical but damning admission that Fast Labs had been instructed to prioritize narrative over verification. Each addition to the record made the other side's willingness to litigate on conjecture harder to justify. During the hearings, Lena's public posture remained consistently modest. She gave short statements that emphasized stewardship over spectacle. "My goal," she told a reporter once, "is to ensure Evelyn's intentions are honored and that resources go to the people they're named for." It was a line with no grandiosity, precisely the tone Reed wanted for someone whom the court would entrust with oversight. Her refusal of hush money at the wedding now read as a moral choice. The press tried to make it melodrama. The legal filings made it strategy. Reed and Lena also had to defend against a different threat: attempts to discredit the provenance of the notebook and the USB. Opposing counsel suggested the documents could be fabricated. Reed anticipated that and produced backup: notarized statements from Mrs. Caro, time-stamped photographs stored on independent servers, and corroboration from third parties who had seen Evelyn's correspondence in decade-old community events. Each corroboration built redundancy into their claim. When the court eventually issued a more substantive order that allowed Lena to access certain trust accounts for the purpose of establishing an interim foundation and to freeze discretionary transfers pending full verification, it was the product of months of patient work. It was neither a dramatic victory nor a total triumph. It was a pragmatic instrument of correction. Lena took the order seriously. She set up an interim governance team comprised of independent trustees, an auditor, and a small cadre of community representatives, among them Mrs. Caro. One of the board's first acts, guided by Lena's quiet insistence, was to suspend all discretionary grants that lacked documented recipients and to redirect immediate funds to urgent community needs: support for clinic supplies, emergency food vouchers for families on Kestrel Lane, and a small grant to stabilize the bakery. These were small, tangible things that could be achieved with legal authority, and they mattered to people who woke before dawn and could not wait for protracted litigation to begin. Lena handled each step with the same care she had once used to move packages through back corridors. She signed forms, she sat through long audits, she approved invoices only when they were transparent. Reed advised on litigation strategy. He also explained, sometimes with blunt clarity, how each administrative act now carried legal exposure. She learned to enjoy small, exacting victories: a certified check sent to a clinic, a notarized release for a scholarship fund. Each tangible outcome felt like a stitch in a larger repair. Meanwhile, the case continued to peel back other actions. A journalist uncovered an email from an inner circle, one of those small messages that had once been cultivated for damage control, suggesting the need to contain the leak, a phrase that did not specify violence but implied a campaign to suppress inconvenient fact. That message, once annotated with the sender's IP address and cross-checked with payment receipts, suggested coordinated influence. It fed into investor decisions. More shareholders demanded transparency in the company's philanthropic accounting, and a special committee was formed to investigate how funds attributed to Evelyn had been spent in the past decade. Cade, seeing the legal ground shift, attempted to settle. He proposed a negotiated arrangement, an independent audit, modest restitution payments, and a non-disclosure agreement that would forestall further litigation. Reed counseled caution. Agreements that closed without full accountability would leave structural channels of diversion intact. Lena's refusal was not personal, it was strategic. She wanted systems corrected, not paper closures that permitted future abuses. Settlements could be useful, Reed explained, but only if they included structural reforms, oversight boards, transparent ledgers, and legally enforceable reporting requirements. This is where Lena's moral restraint took its shape. She did not seek to ruin the living. She sought to create accountable structures that would outlast any individual. When the court gave her authority to form an interim foundation in Evelyn's name, supported by the validated trust corpus, she insisted that its bylaws mandate open, annually audited reporting, community representation on its board, and clarity about grant-making criteria. Reed and the independent trustees drafted bylaws that required public disclosure of grantees and a helpline for community members to inquire about funding priorities. The Foundation's charter emphasized restorative aims, clinics, scholarships, and micro-grants for local businesses like Mrs. Caro's Bakery. The Foundation became a vessel for something practical. Lena, who had been invisible most of her life, now oversaw spreadsheets with grant lines and project proposals. She learned to read audits with the same attention she previously gave addresses and delivery windows. She was no longer a courier, but a steward with fiduciary obligations. The shift felt enormous and ordinary at once. She named Mrs. Caro to the Foundation's Advisory Council, a gesture that was both symbolic and functional. The woman who had kept Evelyn's letters had the right to speak on community needs. It would be a mistake to say that everything smoothed once the Foundation existed. Legal fights continued. Opposing counsel filed appeals and motions that stretched resources and patience. The court approved several of Lena's requests and denied others. But the Foundation's existence mattered. It absorbed energy that might otherwise have been spent on personal vendetta and redirected it into structural reform. Michael's absence continued to complicate matters. There were hints, unsolicited correspondence, rumors of safe houses, but no public reappearance. His legal team filed motions trying to challenge the jurisdiction of certain orders. They argued technical points about the interpretation of Evelyn's documents and the scope of the court's authority. Reed responded with the blunt instrument of evidence, scanned and notarized copies, apostils, affidavits from Swiss trustees who confirmed authenticity. The legal tug-of-war played out in filings and footnotes rather than in theatrics. Occasionally, Lena would see Michael's name in the ledger of filings, his counsel requesting delay, his proxy arguing for a negotiated settlement. News cycles proposed theories: flight, exile, a deliberate retreat to protect assets. Whatever the reason, his absence allowed procedural instruments to proceed without the constant friction of a man accustomed to refashioning outcomes in the press. The case's turning point, the moment when the slow work of law had more purchase than the quick spin of reputation, came when an external auditor's final report cataloged a clear pattern of misdirected funds that had been repurposed away from charitable use. The report, submitted to the court, contained annotated evidence: invoices with no matching services, payments routed through conduits, lab reports with inconsistent server logs. It did not paint a story of malice so much as of a system that had permitted diversion. The court's response was procedural but firm: restitution to the trust for misapplied funds and the imposition of tighter governance standards. Restitution, in practice, was not immediate. Recovering money moved through multiple jurisdictions and shell entities required cooperation from foreign banks and law enforcement channels. Yet the court's ruling gave prosecutors enough jurisdictional footing that lenders and intermediaries started to comply with subpoenas. The practical effect, over time, was that previously fluid funds were constricted. Trust distributions resumed in a constrained, accountable manner under the supervision of the interim trustees and Lena's foundation. Lena's leadership at every stage was marked by restraint. She refused to gloat publicly when the other side's machinations were exposed. She refused to exploit Michael's absence for personal vindication. When journalists asked if she felt triumphant, she replied with a quiet line that became a touchstone for coverage of the aftermath. "This isn't about winning, it's about making sure things named for people are used as they were intended." Her restraint did not mean inaction. She used the legal tools available to her to enforce accountability. She ordered forensic audits of specific accounts, requested public disclosures, and worked with the Foundation Council to set up a transparent grant review process. She engaged with community leaders to understand pressing needs and ensured that immediate funds addressed urgent matters like clinic supplies and bakery stabilization grants. Small things, vaccines stocked, ovens repaired, mattered tangibly. As the foundation moved from emergency distributions to more formal programming, Lena established scholarship criteria for local students and a microgrant program for small businesses. The bakery received funding for equipment and a small fund to hire an assistant baker. Mrs. Caro, who had once pressed a velvet pouch into Lena's hand, now sat on a small advisory table where she argued with the practical specificity of someone who counted costs for a community lunch program. The foundation responded. The pendant, which had ignited the story, ceased to be a dramatic prop and became a quiet icon behind glass in the foundation's modest offices. Lena kept it in a velvet box when she traveled for hearings. She allowed photographs to be made for the Foundation's transparency report, where an annotated caption described the pendant's provenance and the series of actions it had catalyzed. It was no longer a talisman for romantic destiny, but a reminder of how a small object could illuminate a larger system. People asked Lena about her future. She found she did not want to be the head of a philanthropic machine forever. She preferred the specificity of stewardship, good governance, transparent ledgers, and community responsiveness. She trained local administrators in fund oversight and requested that the Foundation's bylaws require community representation. She pushed for an annual third-party audit made public. The goal was to make accountability a norm, not a personality. Michael's legal position eroded over time. With asset constraints, investors shifting, and public institutions cooperating with subpoenas, his operational influence diminished. He did not reappear to storm back into public life. Instead, his name receded into filings and periodic legal motions. The headline that once read, "Mafia Boss Disappears," softened into legalese about unavailable for comment and subject to ongoing court processes. For those who preferred villains to narratives, the non-appearance was unsatisfying. For those invested in institutional fix, the disappearance was, ironically, an opportunity to rebuild systems. The Foundation's early wins, repaired ovens, funded clinic nights, a scholarship dispersed to a high school senior who had once helped with deliveries, were small but public. They were the kind of outcomes that turned abstract talk of restorative justice into receipts and photographs of children with book bags. Lena insisted on documenting impact, before and after inventories, receipts, photographed distributions, and testimonials logged into the Foundation's public report. Transparency, she had learned, is not a slogan, but a set of repeatable acts. There were darker edges to the work. Opposing counsel filed appeals that delayed some restitutions, and certain donors pulled back from public association. Some communities, understandably, remained skeptical that money once diverted could be made right. Lena met those doubts not with rhetoric, but with process, audits, open meetings, and an offer to fund third-party evaluators to assess the foundation's effectiveness. Over months, trust, different from legal trust, began to accumulate. The pendant never lost its symbolic power. At a modest ceremony to mark the first round of restored grants, Lena held it for a moment in her hand before placing it back in its velvet. She felt the weight of decisions made in courtrooms and conference rooms and the quiet of small ovens in the bakery. She thought of Evelyn, a woman whose name had drifted for years in the margins, suddenly being read aloud in board minutes and funding proposals. The transformation did not feel like victory so much as stewardship, an alignment between intent and practice. If anyone believed in retributive spectacle, there were disappointments. No dramatic arrest, no public shaming, no moment of cinematic triumph. Instead, there were audits, restitution schedules, and governance reforms. For Lena, that was enough. The point had never been to watch Michael fall, but to ensure that Evelyn's named resources served named people. She had refused hush money at the wedding not for theatrics, but because she understood the long arithmetic of responsibility. In private moments, Reed reminded her of a truth lawyers know too well. Legal instruments can be blunt. They do not fix everything. They can enshrine new practices, establish oversight, and demand transparency. They cannot remake human choices. Lena understood that. She also understood that persistent procedural correction, the stamps, affidavits, and public reports, created a new default for the future. People would find it harder to divert funds when audits were routine and trustees were independent by charter. The law had built scaffolding where previously there had been comfortable opacity. As months passed, the story's tone shifted. Where once feeds had clamored for gossip about chandeliers and abandoned brides, they now ran op-eds about the importance of fiduciary transparency and the mechanics of trust law. Legal clinics and nonprofit counselors reached out to offer pro bono workshops. Local journalists produced explainer pieces about chain of custody and the practicalities of auditing philanthropic gifts. The pendant's image, once exploited for scandal, appeared alongside a modest list of grants that had been restored. Lena's life did not become glamorous. She continued to wake early. She checked grant requests and walked to the bakery to taste a batch of bread and to talk about community needs. Her wrist cradled the small velvet box sometimes when she slept. Other nights she forgot it entirely. The shift in her identity, from invisible courier to reluctant public steward, felt like a long route she had taken before realizing it had destinations. Legal closure, when it came to a large measure, was bureaucratic. A restitution agreement approved by the court, a consent decree imposing reporting requirements, and a final audit acknowledgement that returned a portion of funds to the trust. Some defendants agreed to civil settlements that included ongoing oversight. Others continued to litigate smaller points for months more. The press covered the court's adjudications with less appetite for drama and more attention to the reforms the court ordered: mandatory annual audits, third-party trustees for certain charitable disbursements, and a public portal for grant records. When the court set a final hearing to approve the creation of the Evelyn Kestrel Foundation as a permanent, independent entity with a diverse board, Lena stood quietly as the judge read the order. The words were procedural and consequential. They created a structure meant to prevent the kind of private diversions the audit had revealed. The judge's voice named the foundation and described its purpose: honor the charitable intentions of Evelyn Kestrel and maintain transparent stewardship of assets. In the following weeks, the foundation opened a modest office on Kestrel Lane. The same chandelier light that had once flashed on the pendant now pooled over a table where grant applications were read aloud. There were measurable outcomes: A clinic received funds to add a vaccination drive. A small grant allowed Mrs. Caro to hire an apprentice. Scholarships were awarded to 2 students. The pendant sat in a small display case in the foundation's meeting room, labeled simply and plainly, a reminder that small things can reveal systems. Lena did not keep the pendant as a trophy. She kept it as a talisman. At the foundation's inaugural public meeting, she lifted the velvet box and spoke without flourish. "This belonged to someone," she said. "That someone left a name and an intention. My job is to make sure the intention is met. That means transparency, oversight, and accountability. Not revenge, not spectacle, just work." The crowd's applause was modest and sincere. Mrs. Caro clapped with the gravity of someone who had seen both bread and law move in different registers. There were questions about sustainability, about governance, about the ongoing litigation. Lena answered them plainly, with the patience of someone who had learned that important things are accomplished by forms as much as by fervor. She outlined the foundation's bylaws, the audit schedule, and the complaint line. She described grants, reporting, and an annual community hearing. She described how the pendant, once a catalyst for scandal, was now an artifact of accountability. Michael's name appeared in the press occasionally in legal updates. His legal team continued to pursue narrow appeals. Some assets remained subject to dispute. But his public presence was minimal, and the practical levers of discretionary giving had been fenced. Where power had once been exercised in deal rooms and private accounts, oversight now held a place at the table. The foundation's first year closed with modest audits completed and a transparent report posted online. The report contained spreadsheets and photographs, lists of grantees, and narratives from recipients. Lena included a short reflection on the first page, not a triumphalist essay, but a clear statement about responsibilities. "Money named for a life," she wrote, "is a promise. Our job is to honor that promise transparently. This report is a part of fulfilling that obligation." People who had once mocked the wedding spectacle now called the foundation a model for accountability. Others remained skeptical. For them, the work continued to be slow and insufficient. Lena accepted that skepticism as part of reform. It keeps institutions honest. She continued to show up at meetings, to read audits, and to insist on transparency. The pendant, small and hammered, found its final role as a reminder rather than a prize. Lena kept it in the velvet box, not on a shelf of trophies, but in a locked drawer where the foundation's officers could access it for ceremonial reference. When donors came to give large sums, when the board read the institutional bylaws aloud, the pendant's image was sometimes used in slides to remind trustees that small, overlooked things can be the hinge of accountability. Years later, the bakery's sign read Caro & Co., established 1983, and had a small plaque acknowledging a foundation grant that had allowed the bakery to expand its ovens and hire a trainee program. The clinic on Kestra Lane had a waiting room with posters about transparency and a donation box with a ledger explaining how funds were used. Scholarship recipients sent letters of thanks that the foundation printed in its annual report. The ledger that once recorded strange transfers now recorded small but durable restorations. Lena's life recalibrated into ritual. She still carried notebooks, but they were now full of grant proposals and meeting minutes rather than routes and drop-off times. Reed remained at her side as counsel and friend, sometimes dry, sometimes wry, always precise. He would send notes about filings and later jokes about the tedium of jurisdictional disputes. Cade and Sharon faded to the peripheries of public life. They continued to appear in filings and boarding reports, but no longer had the immediate access they once enjoyed. Michael's absence became a footnote in affidavits rather than the dramatic center of gossip columns. On an ordinary afternoon, Lena opened the velvet box and cradled the pendant once more. The silver had the same small dents. The chain held memories of cold mornings on delivery routes. She thought of Evelyn, her manner, the handwritten initials in a worn notebook, and of Mrs. Caro, who had kept things because someone had asked. She thought of how slowly and exactly law had moved: subpoenas, server logs, notarized copies, audit reports. None of it had the immediacy of scandal. All of it had the force of consequence. The final image closes not with a triumphal display, but with a modest ceremony. Lena, in a small meeting room, passes the pendant to Mrs. Caro to be placed in a community archive at the bakery. It will not be locked away to gather dust. It will be there as an object people can see and ask about. It will be accompanied by the Foundation's first transparency report. A child who might one day inherit scholarship money will one day hold the pendant, read about audits, and understand the work it took to make resources match intention. Before she places it down, Lena offers one sentence that is not a manifesto, but a method. Keep the records. Let the law be the slow measure, not the quick fiction. She lays the pendant into velvet and closes the box. The bakery bell rings. Outside, life goes on. Inside, the ledger is reconciled, the ovens heat, and the Foundation's reports continue to be posted on a modest website. The pendant is a reminder. Small objects can expose systems, yes, but durable repair requires patient pages and witness signatures. The city's lights are the same as ever, sometimes harsh, sometimes forgiving. But here, in a small corner of a neighborhood that once provided Evelyn with companionship over coffee, receipts and transparency hold. If you want the next chapter, how the audits evolve into long-term governance lessons and how local communities build guardrails against secret diversions, subscribe and follow the series.